We're fortunate to have my guest this morning. He is Brian Murray. Brian is the founder of Washington Street Properties, a commercial real estate company located in Watertown, New York. Brian founded the company in 2007 and has since grown his portfolio to include multifamily, retail centers, office buildings, and mixed-use spaces, all in Watertown, New York. Washington Street Properties has been acknowledged multiple times for their excellence and growth, including the Gold Stevie Award. Inc. magazine has ranked the company, and he's also been recognized as one of the fastest growing real estate companies in New York and in the nation. He's also an author. He's written the book Crushing It in Apartments and Commercial Real Estate, How a Small Investor Can Make It Big, which is on my short list to read. Brian, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Darren?
I'm good. I'm excited to talk with you today, and but before we get going here, if you could do myself and the listeners a favor and fill in a little bit more about your background, tell us a little bit more about you than the little intro I did there.
Sure. I started my company it was about 10 years ago, and I think back, and I had just a couple years before that kind of stepped off the corporate track. I was really looking for a little bit more work-life balance, and I changed directions and started teaching. And I really enjoyed that. I was teaching marketing and entrepreneurship actually at a community college. And one of the things I came to realize as a teacher was it's a little harder to make ends meet and pay those bills. So I decided the time was right to maybe pursue an interest I'd always had in real estate. And I started looking at properties and reading books and doing my research. And I started off looking at single family homes and duplexes and the like. And I would run the numbers and look at the properties, and I just wasn't satisfied with what I was finding. And I gradually looked at a little bit bigger properties and a little bigger properties. And with the help and encouragement of some brokers, I came to understand that there were some creative ways I might be able to find larger properties and invest on a little bit bigger scale, even though I didn't have a portfolio yet or any investment experience. And I think one of the things that's unusual is I jumped right in. That first property ended up being a 50,000 square foot office building. So that's how I got my start.
Yeah, unusual with a capital U. I would say that's pretty impressive. A couple of questions in that. So you were in corporate. Were you in the Watertown area before, or whereabouts?
I wasn't. I was living in Reston, Virginia, and I worked at a large technology company, an internet company, and I'd been there for about 5 years, and it was time to decided it was time to make a change. So I relocated to upstate New York, and that's where I found my teaching opportunity, and that's where I ended up starting my real estate company.
Got it. Well, a couple of things that kind of come to mind is, so, and I want to back up here a little bit with,
Sure.
how big of a town is Watertown?
Watertown, I think it was about 3 years ago, was designated a metropolitan statistical area, which the threshold for that is 50,000 people. So the downtown, the city limits itself, I believe, is around 30,000. The metropolitan area is a little over 50,000.
Okay. And are there major employers, or what is kind of the
Well,
industry in the town?
yeah, probably the biggest employer in the area, in the entire region, actually, is there's a fairly large military base, Fort Drum, which is located not too far from Watertown. Watertown is north of Syracuse. Syracuse is obviously a larger metropolitan area, but that's a good 50 miles away.
Got it. Well, I'm always curious because a lot of people I talk with are always, they kind of zero in on certain MSAs and of size and note,
Sure.
and clearly I think there's justification for that in many cases, but I'm always interested in hearing how others have identified other opportunities outside of those kind of narrower criteria.
Yeah,
Um,
I think one of the, that's a really interesting observation. Looking back, I think what I've learned is that the larger metropolitan areas are, of course, where many of the large players really focus their efforts and want to be. There's a very high demand and intense competition in those larger metropolitan areas. Likewise, if you go on the very opposite end of the spectrum, if you're too rural, there's just not a lot of investment opportunities. I mean, they're scattered around. There's a limit to how much you can grow and have a concentrated portfolio. But when you get to that middle of the road, maybe the smaller to mid-sized cities, I think there's a little bit less competition. I think a lot of times investment opportunities can be overlooked. And I think that you can secure investments with better cap rates in those areas as a result. So I think while the city I ended up starting my my business in it isn't necessarily certainly isn't large and certainly isn't sought after, there were some advantages to that as well.
sure, no, you were able to kind of be a bigger fish in a smaller pond, if you will, kind of thing. If and like you said, the competition. I mean, obviously the major metro areas where there's a lot of competition for whether it be the REITs or large investors that are going to, and the competition's going to push the cap rates down and make that a little skinnier return there. So you mentioned kind of books, talking to brokers. Was there any one that really kind of was a kind of a voice of clarity that really helped you along the way?
My biggest goal was to digest as much information as possible, and I read dozens of books at the time, had hundreds, if not thousands, of conversations, and I feel like I took a little bit of something out of each one. To this day, I can't really look back and say, hey, there was one book or one resource that was head and shoulders above all the rest. Steve Burgess has a really good book on apartment investing that I recall. I learned a lot from and followed some of his philosophies on value add, although that book places a pretty heavy emphasis on adding value and then selling and then working your way up to larger properties, whereas I've adhered pretty strictly to a buy and hold approach. But that was part of that lack of finding that single resource that explained it all. That was part of the motivation for writing my own book, just to share what I've learned. Certainly doesn't cover everything, but at least it's another resource for folks out there.
Got it. Let's talk a little bit about your first deal.
Sure.
So you were teaching at the time, correct?
I was.
Okay. And did you find the property first, or I guess you said you were looking at all sorts of different like single family, multifamily, or different
Yep.
properties and stuff.
Yep.
How long along the way was it before you kind of focused in on this property once you decided that real estate was something you wanted to pursue?
I looked at properties for the better part of a year, actually, and I just slowly looked at larger and larger properties. I remember looking at a 9 unit. I remember being very excited about a 21 unit multifamily. When I came across this office building, my first reaction was there's just no way. It's too big. It's too expensive. But I asked a lot of questions, and I was open to the possibility. And I had seen some other properties that some techniques got introduced to me. So one of the things that really caught my interest right away was when I discovered that part of the asking price was meant to cover an early payoff penalty that the seller was going to incur when they sold the property. And that early payoff penalty was in excess of $200,000. And so, one of the techniques that I had focused on as a creative way to be able to afford one of these larger properties was to assume financing. So when I found out that they were open to that, and that I could get the property at a reduced price, assume the mortgage, that was one of the key things that allowed me to bridge that gap and have my funds go a lot further. But at the same time, as I did my due diligence, I just got more and more encouraged because while the property was a mess and had been for sale for a really long time, the more I looked at it, the more I saw things that I felt really confident could be addressed.
I want to back up there on the financing, the ability to assume the financing. Was that did you have to do some sort of a master lease, or was that an actual just the contract was allowed for or the financing allowed for assumption?
The financing allowed for assumption. So, and I've seen people use master leases. I've also seen some of those put some people in jeopardy. So you have to be very careful about a master lease arrangement. In this particular case, the mortgage did allow for assumption if the lender approved, and that actually ended up being a challenge because here we have this large borrower that has a portfolio of office buildings all across the Northeast, and the bank felt, hey, this property is in distress, it's losing money. Why are we going to switch the mortgage over to this small borrower? And what was interesting is the seller, since they were highly motivated, they really went to bat for me with the lender, and they used their relationship with the lender to help make this happen. The other thing is that the bank put a lot of requirements in place. It was a fairly onerous mortgage, but they jacked up the reserve account requirements and things like that they weren't going to make it particularly easy for me. But in the end, they did approve it, and that was able to cover about 90% of my purchase price.
Wow. And you mentioned the requirements and stuff. I guess that conversation. Was there anything? Was it basically? I guess what I'm trying to understand is, can you take us through that process? Was it? I'm assuming it wasn't just Brian's a good guy. We want to sell the building.
No, and this is where my business background came into play and was pretty helpful and has been an asset ever since. But I ended up writing what amounted to a pretty thorough business plan. I mean, I took this very seriously, and I prepared a pretty substantial document that demonstrated all my analysis of the local market, my pro formas for the property, my approach that I was prepared to take, and what I was going to do in order to turn this property around and stabilize it. So that helped a lot, and they could see that I had done my homework. They could see that I had a plan, and I think there were throughout our series of conversations with the bank, I also involved and hired a very capable, experienced attorney, commercial real estate attorney. And, I had started the process off using an attorney that normally handled smaller properties. And I quickly realized that if this was going to work, I needed to have somebody on my side who was very experienced. And I think having that commercial real estate attorney present on my calls and throughout that process dramatically increased the chances of the assumption going through.
I like that. I hear that a lot. The essentially the team.
That's right.
You weren't just Brian, the newbie investor, but you had the credibility of your experienced attorney, which I'm assuming helped quite a bit.
That in my business plan,
Oh,
that's exactly what I put was a team. I actually went out and took the time to meet with, for example, experienced accountant, and I put their profile in my business plan. And I did the same with my broker, my attorney, and numerous other people, professionals that I knew I would need. I went out and I found a property management company who would back me up because the lender insisted on that, but I was able to use their qualifications. And I had an agreement with them. I ended up basically managing the property, and they were initially oversaw what I was doing to give the lender comfort that that experience was there behind me.
Got it. And I think you mentioned, but I want to make sure I didn't miss it. The seller, why were they selling? Was it basically, you said it was not performing for them, or was there a?
They had originally held a portfolio of office buildings in northern New York, and they had sold all of them off except for this one. And they had stopped paying attention to it a long time ago. It had literally been years since anyone from corporate had been on site. They'd completely let it go. It was off their radar. They just wanted to get rid of it. They were focused on investments in other parts of the Northeast, and this was just one that was just left over, and they were just anxious to get rid of it.
Got it. Um, so let's talk a little bit about the financing. You're a well, a teacher. You've come from corporate. Now you're putting your team together. What kind of, or where were you able to get your? Did you have enough for the down payment, or what was the? Can you tell a little bit about that?
Sure. Um, the mortgage assumption, like I mentioned, covered about 90% of it. But I also, in studying the mortgage situation, I was able to secure some credits at closing. So, for example, one of the things that became evident to me was that the escrows were going to have to be replaced. And so I actually negotiated some credits at closing to replace the escrows. And so I got credits to offset that. And there were several other credits. I had an eye toward minimizing that cash input. And, I ended up covering all but try to remember the exact numbers. I think I had to come up with somewhere between $70,000 and $80,000. And at that point in my life, that required investing all of my savings and basically draining my retirement account. So it was certainly a risky approach. And when aspiring investors come to talk to me about it, I never advocate taking on that kind of risk. But I at the time, like I said, I did my homework. I looked closely at this property. I had a pretty long list of things I knew I could do to change things right out of the gate. And so, maybe it was good I didn't have more experience, or I might have it might have scared me away even more than
Right.
so.
Well, and let me ask you. So the 70 or 80 that you needed, were you did you do it inside your IRA, or did you take
No.
the funds from your IRA and pay the penalty then to use that?
Paid the penalty, drained the account, and the rest was just in a savings account or a brokerage account. So
Gotcha.
yeah.
You've mentioned your view on investing is kind of more of a buy and hold.
Yeah.
Is there a typical strategy? I guess when you're identifying a property,
Yeah.
is there a criteria, a certain? I mean, is it value add, or can you describe?
Well, really, that first property set the tone for the rest of my investing. So there was a whole host of issues that were causing that property to lose money, a whole host of neglect, and I was able to address all those and add a tremendous amount of value. And so that became my strategy going forward that I use to this day. I look for properties that are poorly managed or at least undermanaged, that have value add opportunities. And oftentimes that's from landlords who are absentee or out of state, maybe aren't in touch with the property or the local market conditions. But I want to find a property that's in a good location. In our community, if it has parking, that's very valuable because there's some constraints on parking, and has that opportunity to add value. So I think that for small investors just getting started that want to be in the commercial space, that ability to step in and add value right away, it mitigates your risk and gives you the opportunity for a huge upside.
And what I heard you kind of saying is a lot of the management, is that a lot of the what you find to be kind of the link or the common link that maybe it's the underperformance of a property or where you can actually make a difference? Am I hearing you right?
I think that's an accurate statement. There's just no substitute for having an ownership presence that's local in terms of no one else is gonna look to it with the exact that level of care. But also that local presence that keeps you in touch with the marketplace. So, for example, if you have it doesn't matter if it's an office building or an apartment complex or a retail plaza. If you're local and you're actively involved in the management, you're going to have a pretty good idea of what the conditions are. And you're going to know, hey, am I charging too much? Am I charging too little? What are the amenities that I should be offering? How can I be competitive? And with that knowledge, you're in a much better position to secure tenants, retain tenants, optimize the value of your property. And if you're close at hand, you'll recognize when things aren't being taken care of to the level that you expect or your tenants expect, and you can step in and make sure everything is up to par.
Uh, on your first property, I mean, I'd be totally remiss if I didn't ask you to go into a little bit of details about this thing because I've heard the story before, but just some of the particulars that you identified that were easy to fix and you were able to correct right away out of the chute. Can you share with the listeners a little bit about that office building?
Sure, and the things they're not really particularly complicated, and so I think that first property is a good example. And here I was, I'd never done any real estate investing before, but when you walk up to the front of the building and the landscaping is overgrown and there's trash everywhere, and this is supposed to be a nice office building, you realize that hey, no, this is just not being taken care of. One of the things that I observed, maybe this is one of the advantages of the mortgage assumption, which dragged out for a very long time, and around 6 months or so, is I got to observe the property for an extended period of time and see what was going on. And one of the things I noticed, for example, is on a really hot day, the air conditioning would be cranked on high and all the windows would be open. And when the weather turned to the cool weather, you could see that the superintendent would turn the air conditioner off and crank the boiler on high. And even on the coldest days, that made it too hot, and so all the windows opened. So that was the way the tenants controlled the temperature in their suite, was how wide did they have to have their windows open on any given day to offset the AC or the heat. And I can still recall standing along the side of the building, looking at a row of open windows on a really cold day, and you could literally see the heat rolling out of the window.
Just the steam coming out of the building there.
Exactly. And I just looked at that, and those were dollar bills rolling up into the sky. Those are just a few examples. I started to inquire about, hey, why are all these suites vacant? And I had already established some relationships with the brokers in the area, and they told me, hey, it's pretty simple. We don't show that property because the owners don't pay. And I knew that was a situation I could fix as well. I'd already established relationship with the commercial brokers, and when a commercial tenant's looking around and they enlist the aid of a broker, if the broker's not even showing the property, of course it's going to be vacant. And those were just a few things. The superintendent, there was one full-time employee. He was always hard to find when we got there. I don't know where he was. At one point, doing a thorough tour of the property, we discovered that he had set up a large wood shop on site where he would refinish furniture while he was at work.
Custom furniture. Huh?
So, I think the biggest change was on that first day of closing, where we walked over to the property, and I immediately got the superintendent and I said, "Hey, I want to know how to adjust the thermostat here. Like, this is crazy. The air conditioning cranking." And so he took me to where the thermostat was, and I asked him how to adjust it. And he said that he couldn't because it was locked. And I asked him how to unlock it. He said he had no idea. So I think it was maybe 5 minutes later that I fired him, and I called the thermostat manufacturer, had them walk me through how to program the thermostat, and I set it so that it would turn down nights and weekends and actually fluctuate with the outdoor temperature like it was supposed to. And from that point forward, I actually in that first year, the all of the utility bills got cut in half.
Wow.
And there was a $50,000 labor cost that was completely eliminated. And I would come in the morning before I went off to my teaching job and take care of what needed to get done. Sometimes I'd come back during my lunch or after work. And, for those initial first 1.5 to 2 years, I did most of that superintendent's work myself until the building was turned around to the point I could support an actual employee.
No, that's pretty cool to be able to cut your costs so significantly right out of the chute like that. And 50% on energy, that's a big savings. And I'm assuming then that the tenants probably enjoyed it that much more, having a comfortable space as opposed to always having to check the temperature outside to monitor the inside
Oh
space.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, the tenants loved it, and it didn't take that much effort to really get them excited because it had been so neglected. So, just by walking around in the morning and picking up any bits of litter or trash that I could find, and addressing the landscaping in the front of the property, the tenants appreciate it when they see that someone's making an effort and taking care. That's their image there as well. And these are things that almost anyone is capable of doing. I didn't have to have any special knowledge, and when things came up that I didn't understand, I knew I could call on somebody that did have that expertise. So it really wasn't as complicated as some people might make it out to be.
no. Well, like I said, being able to cut your expenses and that easily that's a huge win. So
Yeah.
congratulations for that. Let's talk a little bit more. You mentioned on this first deal, the financing was owner assumption, and you ponied up your retirement and some cash and got into it, and that you're doing buy and hold. Have you done any refinancing to further your investments, or how are you doing your subsequent investments?
Yeah, refinancing is a major part of how I have been able to grow the company. I After I assumed that mortgage, I really gained an even greater appreciation for how onerous some of the terms were, and I became very motivated to refinance as soon as possible. Unfortunately, I couldn't get anybody to refinance for the first couple of years. And my second property I bought with owner financing. And so at that point, I had two commercial properties, still couldn't get a bank to lend to me. The second property was 50% full when I bought it, and after I'd held it for a year, it was 100% full. And it was right about at that point that I finally got a bank to agree to refinance both of those properties, pull some cash out, and I secured enough cash. I actually went out and bought three more properties at that point. And
Wow.
I've purchased at least that many properties every year since then. So that's been the approach. Find properties that have that value add opportunity, add the value, refinance, with cash out, take that cash and buy additional properties. A lot of the improvements in the properties are financed through the cash flow. And it's kind of funny to think back that my motivation when I first started out was I wanted to make some extra income. But then what ended up happening is I couldn't get myself to pull any money out for a really, really long time. And I refused to quit my job. And a lot of that had to do with I just couldn't get myself to pull cash out because I was very motivated to keep reinvesting the cash flow back in and improving these properties. And I could see that if I pulled money out, it was going to slow things down. I became very motivated to build a property with build a portfolio with the properties reinvesting back into themselves, which I could tell that no one else was doing, and gave me a huge advantage for growing that portfolio.
When you're looking for a property and in order to make these things cash flow, are you able to achieve a cap rate north of 8, 9? Are you on actual numbers when you're making your acquisition, or can you describe a little bit about the market there?
Sure. It's changed pretty dramatically. Cap rates in our area, being a tertiary market, are substantially higher than you find in a primary or secondary markets. Back in 2007, 8, 9, when I started, was a little easier to find something at we could even find things 10, 11, 12% cap rate when I was first starting out, but over the last, say, 5 years, it's become progressively more difficult to find cap rates at that level out of the gate. And we've gotten more creative in what we do. We've purchased some properties at foreclosure, taken some bigger chances. We did a project 2 years ago where we converted a distressed hotel into studio apartments. And so we've gotten more creative to try to still achieve those higher cap rates. I can still find properties that are at a higher cap rate than in some of the hotter markets all around the country. I could still find certainly an 8, but definitely 9, 9.5 cap rate. It's very challenging, even in this tertiary market, to do much better than that. And the way we've done better than that is by being creative, having change in use, some auction purchases, some of which have worked out fantastically, and others which have been a challenge. Yeah, that's kind of where we're at. I would say, if knowing the market, finding off-market properties, I can still sometimes find a 9 cap, 9.5 cap.
Got it. Do you engage in any cost segregation studies? Are you using that for any of your properties?
We do. The first properties, it was probably 5 years ago where we reached a size, and I started to had cost segregation brought to my attention, and so it applied very well when we moved into multifamily, and it's much more cost effective to have the studies done in multifamily when you have uniformity of over a large number of units. They can come in and analyze, say, a typical 2-bedroom, a typical 1-bedroom, multiply it out over the entire facility, and generate a report. We've saved a significant amount of money through cost segregation studies, and we've started to use it on some of our commercial properties where it makes sense. I would say, of the properties in my portfolio, maybe 1/3 of them have had cost segregation studies done on them.
Got it. And on the, I just want to ask you one more question on the finance. Are you partnering with anybody, or have you done any kind of syndication, or is that any kind of a path you're on?
I've not done any syndication. I have thus far partnered with a local contractor on one property. that we wanted to do together. But I've got over 30 commercial properties now, and I only have one that has another owner involved. Looking to the future, I do have some younger investors that I've worked with that I may do some deals with, but I'm not right now. I'm really not looking at any type of syndication opportunities. It's tough with my approach to exercise the strategies that have worked the best for me. They don't lend themselves as well to segregation, or I'm sorry, to syndication. That said, I have seen some investors put together some great syndication deals on value add multifamilies, and I know it can work, but I think that you have to be prepared when you bring those investors in. It takes a lot of flexibility away. You've got to redirect cash flow in the way they're normally set up. You're gonna be siphoning off cash right from the get-go. And you're going to be held to a specific timeline, usually for an exit, and that could have a pretty significant effect on your own end return on investment and on the turnaround of the property. That said, there's plenty of reasons why people are motivated to do that. And if you want to get into a smaller equity position that you're willing to take on a very, very large property, a syndication deal is a great way to do that for the right people.
Right. No, it is an interesting strategy, and the more that I've gotten to know people that do it, it's like you mentioned, kind of you are beholden to the investors. I mean, you're promising, or you're offering to a return, and they're looking for the return. So you've got to, like you say, share the cash there so that they can get the return, and then kind of that whole exit strategy thing. I think if your mindset's buy and hold, I think it's, unless I've talked with other people that have a plan of essentially refinancing the property at a certain point to cash out their investors, but yeah. It's a little bit different. So you mentioned, I think you said 30 properties. Is that the current count?
Yeah, I don't know the exact. I should know the exact number. Low 30s. I think we're at like 32, 33, something like that.
All right. And any sense of approximate number of doors or square footages? I mean, you said, or I think I read you're doing multifamily and office and retail and on and on. Is there a count or an approximate count of multifamily doors?
I think it's north of 300. We did a few months back. We sold a 119 unit multifamily. It's one of the first property sales we've done. There's a long story that goes with it, but it was a HUD property that we had originally acquired with the intention of making it market rate, and long story short, we were unable to transition it to market rate, and we identified a partner to work with to help us manage the HUD side, and they ended up acquiring it from us. We weren't interested in growing a HUD portfolio, so that's something that didn't fit well with us. So we did end up selling that. And that right now we're a little north of 300, maybe about 320 doors.
And then what kind of square footage for your office and retail and
I believe I believe the square footage on the portfolio is somewhere around 500,000, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Okay. And with the different types of properties you invest, is there a different strategy that you recognize when you're moving from one asset class to another?
Surprisingly, I'm going to say for the most part, no. It was a natural growth into multifamily from the commercial because of that focus on value add. It was very, very similar considerations when we were looking at the properties in terms of, hey, where are the rents at? How is the management? Is this property being maintained? A lot of the issues were absolutely identical. The biggest challenge was putting in those day-to-day processes to manage it once the property is up and running and stabilized. But it wasn't particularly difficult to do. I mean, we were able to manage that. Our first acquisition in a multifamily was 30 units. So we were able to do that actually with the staff we had on hand at that point. At that point, I had already had a couple of employees, that one of which had worked extensively in multifamily and brought that knowledge. But it's sort of been, I've got staff right now that cross that line and go back and forth between residential and commercial. I've got about 20 employees now managing the portfolio, and a lot of them are dedicated specifically to one side of the house or the other, but there's others that cross over between the two.
Well, it's interesting because, so often I talk to people and they talk about, I could only play in one lane, or, they kind of that specialization kind of thing. And I've got customers that, that are able to do multiple classes like yourself. But I think there is I don't know if it's I don't know, discipline. I think there's just an ability to recognize that it's still, at the end of the day, it's real estate, and you've got tenants, and you've got there's some management issues, and then you got to make the numbers work, and
Yeah. I think it's, in our case, it's particularly helpful. We've done another thing that we've done that's maybe not as common, but we have a pretty high geographic concentration to our properties. So we're actively, managing these properties out of our local office. And so you end up with a lot of synergies when we, for instance, we use one contractor for snow removal, and it doesn't really matter if it's that apart from the snow removal we do on our own, or there's all the different network of contractors that we employ on our properties. We'll go out and solicit bids across the portfolio and get, great service at a great price because we're doing it all at once. We're bundling the work together. A lot of the ongoing maintenance type issues and operating of the properties is basically the same, whether it's an apartment building or an office building. So, having that local presence and having that local knowledge really helps. I think if you are going to have your properties scattered geographically across the country, maybe there's more room for error because if you're crossing into different asset classes in that way, that's might not make as much sense. But for us, it actually it's surprisingly doesn't add that much complexity to our day-to-day operations by mixing them.
Yeah, it seems like you make a good point. The economies of scale are gained through the outside vendors.
Yeah.
And that's really where you're able to achieve that, cost savings with multiple properties.
Yeah.
That makes
in the office as well, right? So all
right.
phone calls come in through one line, right? Mm-hmm. So there's everything gets processed. You have that office space that's shared. There's a ton of economies for us. So.
No, that makes sense. Is there any sense that you might need to look outside to continue, or to maybe balance your portfolio, or kind of reduce the risk? Or is there any any thoughts of going beyond Watertown, New York? Or
yeah, that's a huge thought that we were constantly evaluating the potential for expanding outside of our current footprint. We have expanded into smaller surrounding communities a little bit, but what we haven't done is gone out of state or gone even further away in New York State. The motivating factor to do that is to diversify your risk in some ways. But we're gaining such economies of scale and efficiencies by managing out of a central location. you inherently have lower risk when you're able to drive by a property every day. You're able to walk it as the owner and see what's going on and keep your finger on the pulse. That becomes very challenging to do when you have locations that might be scattered around the country. You can do that through third parties, management firms. You could travel there. That's onerous. You certainly wouldn't gain the types of efficiencies that we gain. At this point, we've elected to stay in our geographic area and not expand. But you raise a dilemma that I'm constantly wrestling with. Should we pursue opportunities? How far out should we grow and expand? And with time, obviously, we have to grow. There's limits to our growth just to in pure size in terms of the market that we're in. So we've started to look more seriously at that, and I expect over time our footprint will naturally grow.
Let me ask you a little bit about marketing. You mentioned, when you were acquiring the first property that you'd kind of established a relationship with brokers. You've grown quite a bit since that first property, up to 30, and sounds like 30 plus. Do you strictly go through brokers, or do you approach owners directly, or how have you identified opportunities for your acquisitions and growth?
I would say that brokers account for somewhere between maybe 25 and 40% of the leads that come to us at this point in any given year. That's another advantage of having a large presence in a smaller geographic area is the longer you're at it, the more people are going to come to you. And a lot of my growth, what I tend to do is focus on specific properties. I try to really understand the market, and I locate properties that are of interest to us. And at that point, I would directly approach an owner and share with them, hey, if you ever have an interest in selling, I hope you'll consider giving me a call. I have an interest in your property, and I do that a lot, and it works. But I've also, at this stage, if there's a lot of owners out there who, if they're thinking about selling, will pick up the phone and reach out to me or shoot me an email before they go to a broker, because they feel like, hey, this is a person who's a legitimate buyer. They're also a person who, if it's a local owner, would feel good about selling their property to, because they can see what I've done with other properties. And sometimes there's that emotional attachment. They know they could bypass paying the broker commission if they work directly with me. And so I get leads coming in that way. But yeah, it's a mix. But certainly at this stage, whether it be for new properties or tenants, there's a ton of word of mouth at this point that really helps us a great deal.
Right. And you said that works the same for tenants as well, then. Yeah.
Absolutely does. And, again, a further advantage of having multiple properties in a single market, when a tenant outgrows a space or wants to reduce space, we can usually accommodate them. If they want to be closer to downtown, or they have some other need, we've got enough properties in the market that we can oftentimes accommodate them and not have to lose them to a competitor.
No, makes sense. Hey, I got a couple more questions here for you.
Sure.
What do you think, and this is, I was thinking about it, is your background being an educator and having gotten into the real estate, you might have some unique insight on this, but what do you think is, I guess what I'm trying to say, what do you think it is that holds most people back from getting into real estate? I mean, you thought about it for a while. You jumped in more than feet first. I mean, head first. I mean, getting in your property on comparing to what other people do. Do you have any kind of sense of what you think holds people back from getting into real estate?
I think it depends on a lot of different factors, but I don't even want to portray that it was easy for me to do that in terms of I had fears like anyone else. I think the first thing is that just a lack of knowledge and a lack of understanding. And people don't necessarily look around, particularly at the larger properties, and view them as investments. They're not something that the average, people know from their own experience from renting themselves, whether it be a house or an apartment or family members, that hey, that there are small local owners for single families, duplexes, triplexes, et cetera, and they see that as achievable. They don't necessarily drive by their local shopping center and go, yeah, maybe I'll buy that someday. It's not even something that occurs to them, and that's just a lack of exposure to the information or the knowledge which you can go out there and get for yourself. And then people just generally fear the unknown. So even if you figured out a way that you could buy that local shopping plaza, in your head you're worried about all those things that you just don't know whether you know or not. You think it must be complicated. Look at the size of that building. It's just, there's probably all kinds of things, the leases, the mechanical equipment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you research it, you talk to people who've done it, you'd realize I'm going to inherit all the leases. The leases are all done. Like, I can read through them and understand them. And if you really can't, then you could get an attorney to interpret them for you. But they're actually fairly straightforward. They're not necessarily exciting reading material, but your average person can plow through it and make heads or tails of it. And something like mechanical equipment or anything else that you might find at a property like that, there are people out there that do that for their living that are hoping that someone like you will call them when you need help. And so just about anything that's complicated that you might encounter, there's people there that can help you out, or you can do it yourself. And I don't think most people are aware of that. And that's probably the biggest thrust of my book, really, was just to I wanted people to know, hey, this looks scary. It looks like you can't do it, but here's what happened to me when I did it. I mean, here's the things I found. Here's how I worked my way through it. You can too. And it's been really rewarding and exciting to see some of the feedback that's coming back from that, because real estate is a real opportunity for the everyday person, whether they're a teacher like myself or a former business person or whatever else they might do. I've at this point met so many people who've done that, and it's an opportunity that's out there, and I think different things hold everybody back, but that's a few of them. And, I encourage people to not be overly intimidated.
Right. Hey, I'm just one quick question here. Do you think, or where do you think you would have been had you stayed on the corporate track 10 years, or at least 10 years later than when you left the corporate world?
Might sound a little morbid, but I think I'd probably be dead.
Well, we're glad you didn't do that.
If I go back and I actually recount this in my book, but if I, what prompted me to get out, and I was in my mid 30s at the time this happened, but one day I had these severe chest pains, which in hindsight I think was just from combining factors, but really poor health, not getting a lot of exercise, poor eating habits, and an immense amount of stress, lack of sleep. And so I turned out to be fine, but it was a real wake up call. And I said, I'm working around the clock. I've lost touch with friends and family. And I wasn't happy anymore. And I said, something's got to change. And then so that was my wake up call. And before the end of that year, I had quit and walked away.
Got it. Well, it sounds like everything's definitely working out much better than the alternative of having stayed there. So glad to hear that.
I'm alive. So
yeah,
it's a good thing.
Before we close, if you don't mind telling the listeners where they can follow you or get in touch with you, and then please be sure to remind them about your book.
Sure. Well, you can always check out our website. It's washingtonstreetproperties.com. And the book is Crushing It in Apartments and Commercial Real Estate, How a Small Investor Can Make It Big. And you can find that on Amazon, or if you go to the book's website, The website is crushingit.info. And on crushingit.info, you can find links to purchase the book at any number of different retailers, whether you want to get the audio, an ebook, or a print copy.
Cool. Did you do the reading for the audio?
I did not do the reading. I kind of
All right.
wish I had, being in a smaller metropolitan area, there's not like a local studio that I think I got. Here I am talking about not being intimidated by office buildings and retail plazas and apartment complexes, but I was intimidated by the technological side of recording my own audio books. So maybe I should have contacted you for some help with that.
Well, no,
So
I just think it's awesome, all the different platforms, and
yeah.
I am in line to get that. So, but hey, Brian, thanks again for doing this, and hopefully we can do this again soon. Really enjoyed it.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Darren. I appreciate the opportunity to be on your show today.
All right, and for our listeners, if you like the show, please go out and share it with somebody you know. It's real easy to do, and you can share Brian's story and anything else we've got coming up as well. That's all we've got this week. Until next time, thanks for listening to Commercial Real Estate Pro Network's CREPN Radio.